I am live. I'm reading Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. I've read this book before. It's written by Stuart Holroyd. It was published in 1977. This is a journey of events through 1974 and 75. And there is a trio. We had in chapter 2 the forming of the triangle. I finished that. We are now on chapter 3, a change of channels. In the previous chapter we explained the participants who were chosen. A word of explanation is owed to the critical reader who asks, "How do you know?" I'm well aware that this story, as it progresses, will read more and more like fiction, and that some readers will be disposed to categorize it as such. That was my reaction when I read Andrija's book, Yuri, which seemed to me to have more in common with Robert Heinlein's science fiction novel, Stranger in a Strange Land, than with any sober and considered work of psycho research. To categorize the book as fiction was the most convenient and comfortable way of dealing with its content, and I'm sure that many readers besides myself reacted in this way. It was not the reaction that Andrija sought, however, nor is it the reaction I seek to the present narrative. Frankly, I do not want to make it easy for the reader to get on comfortable terms with material that has caused me a great deal of discomfort and indeed still does. Which presents a curious problem, for the story has the momentum, coherence and roundness of a good tale, and so to tell it convincingly requires rather the deliberate flaunting than the careful exercise of principles of narrative art. Lest the reader should settle down to enjoying the yarn and should merely suspend disbelief instead of exercising judgment and intelligence to assess the facts, I propose to interrupt the narrative flow from time to time and put in an appearance in propria persona. This will enable me to raise and at least to discuss, if not answer, questions that will occur to the critical reader, and will also afford me opportunities to reassure all readers that I'm still around and have neither taken leave of my senses nor suffered my narrative to be taken over by its protagonists, as novelists are sometimes to do. To the question, "How do you know?" I should like to be able to answer, "I was there, I saw and heard and can vouch for it." But it is true only of a very small portion of the events covered by this narrative. My sources are the tape recordings of the communications, John Whitmore's written account of the early stages of the work, on which the latter part of the previous chapter was largely based, and the oral testimonies of the people involved, all of whom I have been as cooperative and frank as could be wished. I have been able to visit most of the places where the events I record took place, and to obtain and correlate different people's accounts of the events. So I have a vast and indeed daunting body of material out of which to compose this narrative. There is certainly no need for embellishment or invention, and even subjective statements of the type "John thought" or "Phyllis felt" are always based on the subject's own testimony, and should be understood as a convenient ellipsis for "John told me that he thought," etc. I conceive my job as to tell the story as simply and intelligently as its complexity allows, to maintain an objective viewpoint in presenting the material, and do the reader the honor of leaving to his own intelligence a decision as to what he should believe. When I was asked in 1974 to report the May lectures for the Dutch magazine Behest, I devoted one of my 4 articles to the lectures given by Andrija Puharich and Lyle Watson, and began began it with a paragraph which is, I think, germane in the present context. Anyone who writes, reads, or thinks about parapsychological phenomena has at some stage to confront the problem of his own credulity threshold. He's going to be asked to believe some quite incredible things, so he needs to be clear at least about two things. How exacting are his own standards of proof, and to what extent is his intellectual assent influenced by emotional or temperamental factors? Man needs belief, and the bored, the underprivileged, the unqualified, the disaffected, the social misfits, and the rebels are all strongly disposed to believe in anything that mocks orthodox science or religion and its custodians. There is perhaps a touch of Mandarin hauteur in this. When the counterculture emerged in the 60s, I was not particularly enthused. By temperament and education a bookish man with a respect for intellectually achieved order, I tended to regard it as a refuge of mediocre minds, and as a residue of that attitude is to be seen in the above paragraph. My recent research in literary work has caused me to modify that attitude to the counterculture, and has raised my own credulity threshold. But the cautionary remarks with which I prefaced my first brief excursion into reporting Andrija's work are still, I think, relevant. There are many people I know who will have much less difficulty than I have in giving credence to the content of this book, and one thing that worries me is that there are many who will believe it for the wrong reasons. To the outside observer, as I was at the time, the May lectures was an ambitiously conceived and professionally executed operation. The 1,500-seat Metropole Theatre in London's West End was at least half full every evening, and it certainly seemed that the gamble of bringing a California-style consciousness movement convention to England had paid off. In fact, John told me later the gamble cost him £10,000, but it did pay off in the sense that a lot of people were opened up to new ideas and possibilities through it. The conference theme was healing and consciousness, and the contributors ranged from fairly straight doctors and scientists to young and sometimes hippie growth movement professionals, instructors in such arcane techniques as psychodrama, functional integration, bioenergetics, and counter and psychosynthesis. Some of the speakers had breakthrough scientific research work to report. There was Sister Justa Smith of the Human Dimensions Institute at Buffalo, New York, who had recently carried out an impeccable research project which had demonstrated that a psychic healer could cure damaged enzymes. Dr. Elmer Green, head of the Psychophysiological Laboratory of the Menninger Foundation, the leading authority on techniques of voluntary control of internal states by biofeedback, spoke of the implications of such techniques for self-healing. His claims were corroborated by Dr. Carl Simonton, a cancer specialist who had effected some remarkable cures by combining traditional radiation therapy with a patient training course of relaxation, meditation, and visualization. Dr. Norman Shealy, a neurosurgeon, spoke convincingly from his own experience and research on the value of employing psychics in medical diagnosis. The highly controversial topic of the existence of perceptual faculties in plants was expounded by the two best-known experimenters in this field, Clive Baxter, director of the American Polygraph Association, and Marcel Vogel, a senior chemist with IBM. Collectively, these and other contributions to the lecture series powerfully endorsed the New Age awareness that man possesses latent abilities, which can be developed to enhance human life, relationships, and health, and constituted an empirical basis for a holistic philosophy of man and nature, to repudiate and replace the prevailing mechanistic philosophy. It was perhaps symptomatic of the emergence of a New Age awareness and philosophy that a large paying audience was drawn to the Metropole Theatre on each of the 5 evenings, in spite of the fact that the event was poorly publicized. The lack of publicity, too, was symptomatic, for although John and his co-workers made great efforts to interest British television and the press in the fact that a number of distinguished American scientists and parapsychologists were simultaneously present in London and available for interviews, they failed to get any response. Nor did specialist medical bodies, such as the British Cancer Society, show any interest. The contrast between the response of the general public and that of the media and medical establishments clearly demonstrated the principle that it is in the nature of institutions to become entrenched in orthodoxy and to show a paranoid resistance to the zeitgeist. In addition to the evening public lectures, there was a full-time residential program of conferences and seminars for professional participants held at Brunel University. This was arguably the most important part of the program, for it enabled avant-garde workers in the field of alternative medicine to share, corroborate, and consolidate their researches and their insights. But even among this informed and open-minded assembly, there were few who could handle the content of Andrija's lecture, in which he talked about his work with Yuri and led up to telling of his communications with extraterrestrials and his privy knowledge to their plans for a landing on Earth. However, on the last morning of the residential program, the morning after Andrija had given his public lecture, Dr. Elmer Green dropped a bombshell. Dr. Green was, to all appearance, one of the more conservative members of the assembly. He was conventional in dress and meticulous in carrying sound scientific method into his border area of research. And when he stood before the other participants that morning and announced flatly that after much soul-searching he had decided that he must lend Dr. Puharich his support, everybody was astonished. But that wasn't all. Dr. Green went on to explain that the reason he had come to his decision was that he himself had been receiving communications from a non-human intelligence for more than a decade. Having dropped this bombshell, he stepped down from the podium with a demure smile. 2 other participants who reacted to Andrija's revelations with serious interest, instead of with the usual combination of incredulity and hostility, were Norman Shealy and Marcel Vogel. Vogel's own public lecture, challengingly titled Interpersonal Communication Between Man and Plant, was one of the outstanding successes of the evening program at the Metropole. He is a large, genial and sleekly groomed man with a voice and manner that exudes warmth and makes criticism of his fantastic claims seem churlish. When I approach a plant experimentally, he told the audience, I begin by giving it bursts of love. The result is a shift in the permanent baseline of the chart, the strict chart recorder connected to the plant. His lecture included a successful demonstration of telepathy, in which members of the audience were the receivers of an image of a red triangle enclosed in a circle, which he projected, and an unsuccessful demonstration, at least I could see no difference, of how a plant that he gave bursts of love to at the beginning of his talk would flourish, whereas another that he totally ignored would wilt. He also claimed that psychic healing at a distance can be more effective if the healing energy is channeled through a plant, a proposition which led to his participating in what was perhaps the most bizarre event of this week, devoted to the quest for a rationale of the marvelous. In one of the communications held at Ossining the month before, Korean had indicated, in reply to a question of Andrija's, that at the time of the May lectures, Bobby may be able to give a convincing demonstration of his healing ability before the assembled doctors and scientists. So, Bobby and Phyllis had come over to London with Andrija and had been spending the week quietly in a house on the outskirts of London at Mill Hill, loaned by a financier friend of John's, Ian Wasserman. On 20th May, after the first day of the programme, Andrija and John went out to Mill Hill and held their first communication since the one in which they had entered into their commitment. Since then, John learned from Phyllis Bobby had completed 2 quite remarkable healings in Orlando. A young man suffering from pancreatitis, who had been able to eat only baby food and had no energy, had been completely cured after 7 treatments. And a woman scheduled for a cyst operation had been able to cancel it, for after 3 healing sessions with Bobby, there had been no sign of the cyst. Bobby had had personal and marital problems, but his healing power seemed to be developing, as Korean had predicted, and if he could convincingly demonstrate them to the residential program participants at Brunel, this would be a great step towards getting him more widely known. When Bobby was in deep trance and Korean was speaking through him, that first night at Mill Hill, Andrija asked, "Would you give Bobby and us the maximum support, as you did in that burn case? You see, because this is Bobby's first introduction to the world of medicine and science, and what happens here will be carried all over the world in terms of the reputation it establishes. Can we count on your really intense, massive support in this period?" "We will give our entire support," Korean answered. "We want you to know that there is no problem there. The only problem that exists right now is Bobby and his free will. He is fighting to be Bobby and no more. Can you understand?" "I understand what an enormous burden has been placed upon Bobby," Andrija said, "and I know he has to make up his own mind. But may I ask just this? Suppose Bobby, in his own free will, decides he'd rather be a cook than a healer. What will happen then?" "We cannot change a free will," Korean answered. "We do not interfere. We try to help. Bobby sometimes felt like running away," Korean continued, "because he felt that everyone was trying to make him perfect, and he was aware that he was not perfect. They shouldn't be overprotective with him. He should be allowed to act independently and even make some mistakes. Then he'll feel better," Korean said, adding the helpful suggestion, "Let him break a glass." On the subject of the proposed demonstration, healing, they were given precise instructions. There would be no metal on Bobby. Everyone should keep well out of his reach. There would be a great deal of energy channeled, and it was important that no one should touch Bobby or be alarmed by his reaction. "We understand. I think we can cope with it," Andrija said. The instruction that there should be no metal on Bobby was particularly interesting in the light of an extraordinary thing Phyllis had told them some time before. Bobby had had some metal fillings in his teeth, and during the month they had been in Florida, these had been paranormally replaced with compound ones. Bobby had a horror of dentists and certainly hadn't been near one at that time, and the only explanation of the strange transformation was that Korean had dematerialized the old fillings and materialized the new. Andrija, who professed to have experienced many materialization phenomena in his work with Yuri, seemed quite happy with this explanation, but it stretched John's credulity to its limits, and he felt he would get on better with the work if he wasn't asked to believe in such outlandish miracles. Korean confirmed Marcel Vogel's claim that a plant can function as a kind of transmitter of energy when psychic healing is attempted at a distance, so that the preparation of the demonstration equipment was entrusted to Marcel. Distance, he said, was no object, so he made arrangements by telephone for a glaucoma patient in California to be the recipient of the healing energy, and to be in a state of receptive meditation at the time that attempt was made in London. All the residential program participants, some 50 or 60 people in all, crowded into the room at Brunel University in the morning of the 22nd of May to witness the experiment. Marcel brought in a tall, healthy-looking plant and carefully attached two steel electrodes to one of its leaves. The wires from the electrodes passed through a transformer and another piece of equipment to a strip chart recorder, and when the electrodes were attached to the plant, some wild oscillations were registered on the moving graph paper. Then a steady readout was registered, and Marcel announced that the experiment could begin. Bobby wasn't ready, however. He was palpably nervous and wanted to smoke another cigarette before taking his place facing the plant. Phyllis, too, was nervous, though she tried not to show it and give Bobby confidence. She was apprehensive about Marcel Vogel, whose snowman qualities made him an excellent lecturer. Showman qualities made him an excellent lecturer, but were inappropriate in the present situation. At last Bobby composed himself. This was a big moment for him, being the center of attention of all these scientists and doctors. He stood before the plant and held the open palms of his hand out towards it. Marcel announced to the assembly that his consciousness was now locked into the plant, and that the transmission of his healing energy to the patient in California had begun. For about 15 minutes everyone sat around in silence. Marcel monitored the strip chart and described in a loud whisper the oscillations it recorded. Bobby stood and tried to pour out energy towards the plant. Then he began shaking. First his hands shook, then his shoulders and head. Phyllis knew that this was normal when he was attempting a healing, and she was dismayed when Marcel, apparently alarmed by Bobby's increasingly violent movements, suddenly went over to him and grabbed him by the shoulders. As soon as he was touched, Bobby convulsed and moaned, as if a great electric shock had jolted through him, and at the same time many people in the room experienced a kind of shock. Also, they discovered afterwards that this moment the step-down transformer in the power supply blew out. As Phyllis recalled later, everyone in the room had a reaction. Some people had very good reactions. Others were frightened because they could feel the energy going through them. People who had never had a psychic experience had something happen to them in that room. When it blew, the energy just went in all directions. Phyllis' main concern was for Bobby. She went over to him and talked him softly out of his shocked state. His etheric body was shattered, she said, and in an attempt to restore it, she proceeded to give him what she calls an aura sweep. I have seen her do this with another psychic, who said that he felt much better for it, though to the onlooker it looked like an exercise in mumbo-jumbo. Starting at the feet with her palms turned upwards, she slowly raised her hands and arms, keeping them at a distance of about 12 inches from the body on either side. Then brings her hands together above the subject's head, draws away from him, and then shakes her hands as far away as possible from her own body, as if to get rid of a cloying substance. She did this 2 or 3 times with Bobby, and eventually he became calmer. There was still pandemonium in the room, and a lot of people were crowded around Marcel, examining his blown-out circuitry. Bobby said he felt sick, and Phyllis got him quickly out of the room and found a toilet where he vomited violently and repeatedly. Later inquiries established that the glaucoma patient in California had not been cured, though she had said she had felt that something was happening. The curious fact that emerged, which may or may not have had to do with the alleged energy transmission, was that one of the group of people sitting in meditation with a patient in California had suffered a heart attack at about the same time as Bobby's healing attempt had been abruptly halted in London. Disastrous though the experiment was, obviously something paranormal had happened. And in order to find out what, Andrija and Phyllis held a communication through Bobby that night at the house in Mill Hill. But before they could start interrogating Korean about the incident, they were told, "You do not realize what almost occurred today. You have taken a very big chance. Many have worked hard for this day. We had given special instructions concerning this. It could have been a complete healing if it had been done as we asked. We asked before any more discussion that you listen to our last meeting." Obediently, Andrija and Phyllis left Bobby in trance and went into another room to listen to the tape of the communications they had held 2 nights before. "There were 2 points where perhaps we were wrong," Phyllis admitted to Korean when they returned. "Firstly," she said, perhaps she had stood too far away from Bobby and had therefore not been able to give him enough psychic support. And secondly, of course, Marcel had touched Bobby. The second point, Korean said, was correct, but also the instruction that Bobby should have no metal on or near him had not been observed. He had worn a ring. There were coins in his pocket and his clothing had metal buttons. This, they later ascertained, was true. Bobby had worn a new suit which had a military-style jacket with metal buttons. Before the experiment, Phyllis had checked that the zipper in the trousers was plastic, but it hadn't occurred to her to examine the buttons. Also, just before the experiment, Robbie had bought a packet of cigarettes and put the change from a £1 note in his pocket. "We were sending very strong," Korean explained. "This is why we had asked of these special conditions. You did not understand the clothing. We stopped the machine, trying to show you to stop the man. We saw what was about to happen. We stopped the energy before it did damage to Bobby's physical. And in answer to Andreja's question why other people in the room had experienced a strong reaction at the time, Korean said because of the metal, energy was being reflected in many directions. For the patient's sake, Andrija asked, shouldn't they repeat the experiment? Try again, perhaps, without Marcel Vogel working with them. Korean deferred to Phyllis's opinion, and Phyllis said she felt that Bobby was not in a fit condition to make another attempt at present. He was generally in a low state of health and suffering from a cold. "Could you do something to clear that up?" Andrija asked, and received the reply, "The illness he has caused, he holds on to. He is punishing himself." Phyllis asked if there was anything she could do to help. "It is only within him," was Korean's answer, and with this reminder of Bobby's autonomy for better or worse, the session ended. And I'll make here a break and read on soon. Today is the 10th of February.